Thank you very much for the kind invitation and also for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here. Many, many years ago, I sat where you are now sitting. Wasn't quite as nice at that time. But I heard lectures on experimental physics, and I heard lectures on algebra by professors who many of you probably don't even remember by name. Nevertheless, I'm glad to be here. And I would like to introduce you, or not introduce you, but give you my views on the issue of climate change and the transition to the climate crisis. Maybe first, what do I call climate change? What do I call the climate crisis? For me, and this is my personal definition, I try to use climate change when I'm talking about what happens in nature, and when I'm talking about how it affects people, how it affects economy, how it affects maybe other forms of life, then it becomes a climate crisis. And obviously, in some areas and during some periods, it's really already a climate catastrophe. Yeah, and so what you can expect is a discussion of the 1.5 degree goal, which is sort of also an optimistic scenario, and also a discussion on what missing that goal means, a pessimistic scenario, and the implications of both for science and universities. So let's look at what happened in climate sciences since 2015. 2015 was the year in which the Paris Agreement was negotiated and accepted during the Conference of the Parties in Paris. And to general surprise, that agreement also contained a passage saying that, 2 degrees, people, the governments and the countries, the signatories, would limit global warming to 2 degrees or well below 2 degrees. That was sort of expected or hoped for. But then the small island states also achieved an addition, and nations would try not to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. That sort of caught science by surprise, because there was not very much literature on what would happen at a temperature increase of 1.5 degrees. 2 degrees was sort of the lower bound of what had been looked at, and things going upwards from there, but nothing really was available about smaller temperature increases. And so obviously the question arose, is it worth the effort, the economical, societal, political effort to limit global warming to 1.5 instead of 2 degrees? That is just half a degree. Is that really worth it? Do 2.5 degrees really make a difference? And so one of the outcomes of the Paris Agreement was that science should look at that. Science should look at what's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. And of course, what does 1.5 degrees mean for climate, for the greenhouse budget, and for the measures to be taken? So for the following years, climate science had a special focus on small temperature increases on the global scale, and of course also then down to regional and local scales. Meanwhile, we have seen that mitigation stays well behind commitments. There's a huge gap between what needs to be done and what has been offered to be done, and what's being done is even larger, the difference. So science is again switching. If you look at the publications, the focus is no longer 1.5 degrees. The focus is what about 3, 4, or higher degrees, because that is where we're heading to. So large and severe consequences, what does it mean? And that is, of course, a pessimistic scenario. And I'll try to touch on both or discuss both a little bit. So the IPCC set about writing a report on what does 1.5 degrees mean as compared to 2 degrees. And when the scientists were recruited to write that report, there was great skepticism. Are we precise enough? Do we understand the situation well enough in order to really figure out a difference? Will this not be one huge flop? But to the surprise of almost everyone, it turned out that there's a huge difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius global warming. And these are just a few issues, like 11 million fewer people will be exposed to extreme heat, 61 million fewer people exposed to drought, 10 million fewer exposed to the impacts of sea level rise. So you can see from the point of view of the people affected, it's enormous. Those 0.5 of a degree really make a huge difference. Also for biodiversity. And you know, besides climate, the climate issue, biodiversity is one of the other big issues that are really, really global issues of considerable urgency. And it would just saying at 1.5 rather than reaching 2 degrees would have the number of vertebrate and plant species facing severe range loss by the end of the century. And of course, all of this also translates into economic losses and not least into a world that is more economically stable. So the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees Celsius that was published in 2018 is really one of the most direct reports that the IPCC has published. It's really worth reading, and it has, as I said, surprising results for the scientists involved and of course for the others as well. You can find any number of comparisons now. What does it mean, 1.5 or 2 degrees? And it's significant. It is really significant, and one of the final outcomes was every 1/10 of a degree matters. It matters whether we have 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, whatever degrees warming. So every 1/10 of a degree really matters. Now, what does it mean? What does climate at plus 1.5 degrees Celsius mean on the global level? The 1.5 on the global level. Well, the maximum temperature in Europe will be about 3 to 4 degrees above present-day extremes. And that will be normal, above the normals these days. Summer is like 2003, and you might be aware that in the summer of 2003, a heat wave affected Europe that caused some, the values in literature vary, but something between 30,000 to 60,000 deaths, early death. So summers like 2003 could appear every 2 to 3 years. Of course, we would not expect the same number of early deaths because we have learned from that heat wave, 2003. Nevertheless, it will put a severe strain on the health of people. 700 million people in Europe would be under heat stress. 2.6 months of drought per year in Central Europe. So the areas where we get our vegetables, our fruit from, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, about 2 to 3 months of drought every year. That this will have consequences for the economics of those areas and therefore also for the population in those areas. And we will have migration, people seeking work in other places in Europe is sort of obvious, but it is very rarely really said. 4 millimeters per year increase in sea level. That sounds like very little. However, sea level rise is one of those issues that we've sort of started and that will continue throughout centuries and even thousands of years based on what we decide now, what we do now. It takes long. The warming of the ocean is a slow process. Nevertheless, more than 90% of the extra heat that is due to the greenhouse effect goes into the oceans. So the oceans are really warming and warming already to considerable depth. and that will continue. And not only the warming of the oceans causes the expansion, but of course also the melting of ice, land-bound ice. And we know that the ice sheets in Greenland, in the Antarctic, they are all losing substance, and all this is increasing sea level rise. At the moment, the heating, the warming of the water is still the main factor for sea level rise, but as warming continues, melting of ice will become more and more dominant in this respect. Floods in northern Germany, for instance, that now occur every 500 years will occur every 100 years. So it's just a statistical measure. Some 70 to 90% of all coral reefs will be endangered. So you can see, even at 1.5 degrees, the climate will not be pleasant. I called it an optimistic scenario, and it is optimistic, but it is not what we really would like to see. So even at 1.5 degrees, climate is a challenge. But climate, if we achieve this limit, to stay within that limit, climate will have stabilized. We will have stabilized at least that part of climate that is due to human influence. And that is also one of the results of the IPCC report, we as humanity definitely can adapt to a 1.5 climate. It doesn't mean that everybody can stay where they are. It doesn't mean that everybody will continue in the job they have now and use the land they're using now. There will be all sorts of changes, but it is feasible. We can manage that. It is still in a range that we can manage. But there's another aspect, and that is an aspect that I think extremely important, and I will also touch upon. The social and economic conditions will have considerably improved, or at least they can improve considerably in the process of achieving those necessary emission reductions. Because you don't achieve those emission reductions by just changing light bulbs. There have to be really substantial changes in many, many different aspects of our lives. But let's first look at what does the climate budget say? What does it mean? How much do we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in order to stay within those 1.5 degrees Celsius warming? Well, one of the very well-substantiated realities of climate change is that there's an almost linear connection between the cumulative emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and the temperature increase that they cause. There's the usual lack of sharpness and uncertainties, but on the whole, it is very well established that there's a clear relationship between the accumulated emissions since the Industrial Revolution and temperature increase. And due to that well-established relationship, we can derive how much of CO2, how much of other greenhouse gases can we put into the atmosphere overall if we do not want to exceed those 1.5 degrees. And if from that we subtract what we already have put into the atmosphere, then we get what we call the climate budget. Now, the climate budget involves all greenhouse gases. What I'm showing you here is the carbon dioxide budget. That has good reasons, because carbon dioxide is that greenhouse gas that is best researched, that is best monitored, that we know most about. Let's look at the carbon dioxide budget. It doesn't mean that we can ignore the rest, but we can sort of use some simple correlations to assume that we need the same type of reductions for the other greenhouse gases. So what you can see here is a graph of greenhouse gas emissions over time. And the gray part is what we've already emitted. And the area under the emissions over time, obviously, is what the amount of carbon dioxide that already has been emitted. That is some 2,400 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And if we subtract that from the overall amount that is admissible, then we get the carbon dioxide budget, which is something like 500 gigatons of CO2. Now, if we know the area, those 500 gigatons, then we can draw all sorts of lines that are compatible with that area. And the red line is one of those, and a rather plausible one. And that red line says that we would have to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions by 50% by 2030. That is in 7 years' time. And be at net zero by 2050. Now, net zero is not zero. Net zero just means that the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere will no longer rise because we're emitting just as much into the atmosphere as is taken up, for instance, by plants, by soil, by the oceans. So net zero is what is propagated now everywhere, but in reality it means that we're stuck with the concentration that we have achieved at that time, so it's really still too high. But still, let's remain with net zero. So net zero by 2050. These are the global figures. So on the global level, we need to have our emissions by 2030 and then reduce them to net zero by 2050. And if we do that, we can keep within the 1.5 degrees Celsius with a likelihood of 50%. Now, 50% is not very engaging. I don't think anyone would get into an airplane that arrives at the other end with a probability of 50%. But of course, here we're just talking about the future of civilization, so we don't have to be so picky. So that is 50% likelihood. So if we take this as a global assumption, what does it mean for industrialized nations? Obviously, they must reduce faster because I don't think anybody will doubt that we will have to give developing countries a bit more leeway. They still have to do a lot of that development that we've already done. There's too many people still without electricity. There's too many people without clean water. There's too many people who still need the basics for a decent human life. So we need to give them an opportunity to do this development, and therefore we need to give them a bit more of the greenhouse gas emissions than we claim for ourselves. Now, how do we come down from the global values to the national values? Well, there's many different ways, but probably the most accepted one is by population. So you look at the population, the global population, and what percentage of that is lives in a country, and that percentage is also transferred to the greenhouse gas emissions. So if we do that for Austria, it looks something like this. I'm sorry, the table is in German, but you really only need to look at two figures. If we want to stay within those 1.5 degrees without exceeding the 1.5 degrees and then having to take additional carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is only possible to a limited extent. If we want to stay within that limit, with the 50% likelihood that we had before on the global level, we have 430 million tons of carbon dioxide that is available to Austria for emission, starting the beginning of this past year. Or if we want to have a bit more, a bit higher likelihood of 66%, it just leaves us with 460 million tons. Now, you probably don't know what we emit on the average per year, but that is something like 60 million tons. So 60 million tons for the 66% likelihood leaves us with 4 years. One of those years we've almost used up. So that leaves us with 3 years if we don't start reducing very rapidly. And if we look at the 430, well, we have 7 years, but even 7 years is practically nothing. And so that means we don't have to have our emissions by 2030, but we must reach net zero by 2030. Unless we reduce very rapidly, and that could look something like this. These would be the emissions in Austria. The blue one is carbon dioxide. And if you look at that carbon dioxide, we have increased our emissions until about 2005. Then we reached a peak around that year. After that, we had a certain drop, but over the last 10 years, it's been rather constant. We've been going up and down a little bit, but that is mainly a question of the weather, of some maintenance work in one of our main emitters, the first. And every time our ministers for the environment or climate declared, now we've bent the curve, well, it didn't last long, it went back up the next year. So that was not very promising, and it's still not very promising. We have more laws in place now, but the substance of those laws is not very promising in regard of real reduction of emissions. And you can see the two lines. Somewhere in between those reduction by 50% every 2 years and every 3 years is what would be needed if we do not want to exceed the budget that is appropriated to Austria based on the population, which is about 1/1000th of the world population. When you show those graphs, people say, well, that's impossible. I don't know, maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. But that is what science would really ask of us, unless we have some sort of political agreement that other nations will not use up their whole budget and make some of that budget available for us. Now, we've had that type of deal before, and we know that it was not honest deals. The deals would be all right if they were honest, because the atmosphere doesn't care who emits, but the total must be correct, and that is one of the problems. So there would be solutions, but they require honest politics. What can we do to reduce our emissions? I think that's also rather obvious. We can replace fossil fuel energy by renewable energy, and that's obviously a must. We must replace fossil energy. We can also increase efficiency, have similar services with less energy and less of other resources. We can reduce non-energy emissions, that is mainly agriculture and forestry. And we can focus on sufficiency, which means make do with less. And if we look at the incentives of our economic system, then you can see that red arrow going from top to bottom. We have some, not huge, but we have some incentives to replace fossil energy. And the incentives dwindle as you go down. But if you look on the effectivity and the speed with which the measure could become effective, it goes the other way around. The most rapid change would be changes in lifestyle. That would be the most rapid changes, but we have hardly any incentives to do that. They can be very rapid, and they can be enormously effective. And as we go up the scale, they become more, takes more time, and also to a certain extent they become less effective. That green arrow does not mean that renewable energies are not effective at all. That's not what the intent is. It's just the direction, the tendency, because energy is, it depends how much energy we use. And that, again, is a question of sufficiency and efficiency. So it is not surprising that Angela Merkel, shortly before she retired from politics, and typically politicians say that shortly before or after they retire from politics, she said we need a full transformation of our economy, of our way of doing economy. And she's completely right, because we really have to look at all of these fields of economy, and I don't have time to go through all of them, but energy is obvious to anyone. And if it wasn't obvious before, it's become obvious since Europe decided not to buy gas from Russia, and Russia then decided not to deliver gas. So since this war on gas is on, obviously it's become apparent that we need to change something. One can discuss whether the means we are trying to achieve are the right ones. The first thing that happened, if you remember, is our politicians traveling to the Near East to try to find other fossil fuel sources. I didn't hear much about building up the production of solar panels, of heat pumps, of educating people to become engineers to build up those plants and to install them in the houses, something which would have been dearly needed and which would really we would have profited from if it had already happened 30 years ago when the discussion on climate change really became strong. So, but energy is obvious, that makes a difference, and it not only makes a difference on the national level, it's also a geopolitical issue. Industry will have to produce durable products, have a repair economy, products that can be repaired, and products that you don't really need to possess. You just need to rent them. Many things we don't really need to possess. I mean, we all know those hand drills everybody has at home, and they use them about 30 minutes a year. Well, why not use them together? We had libraries for books. I don't know whether the young people even know that, but libraries for books do exist, and they have the same principle. Not everybody needs to buy every book. Many people can read the same book without it being losing its wisdom. So that would be a possibility, and that goes all the way to mobility. We will not be able to everyone have their own car. And I'm very happy to see that among the younger generation, this already has become part of their life, that they are not. And there was a time when people, when they finished school, the first thing they wanted was a car. That has changed, and I'm very happy it has changed. And we don't need cars for everyone. We cannot afford cars for everyone, which means we have to do much more on foot, by bicycle, public transport, which means we have to expand public transport, obviously. I say this because I talked to people with disabilities recently, and they said, well, they were against climate measures because we are trying to forbid cars. Well, obviously, people who have no other means of transportation, who need them of course they will be served by cars also in future. So it's sort of like when I tell people I go by bike in Vienna, then they say, well, what if there's snow? And I tell them, well, Vienna has about 5 days of snow per year. On those days, I use public transport. I will not let my lifestyle be determined by those 5 days. There's so many more days that have a different perspective. And that is what we're hearing all along the way. Whenever we talk about change, we are confronted with the one or the two exceptions when it won't work. So we can go through the rest of it. I don't want to do that all the way. But there's things like the health system that really need change. I had the opportunity to look into the health system a little bit when we did an assessment report on climate and health. And it turns out that the health system, from the first to the last, is oriented on economics, on economic profit. And profit is highest when people are ill. Not very badly ill, but not healthy. They just have to continue. They shouldn't die, but they should continuously be ill. That is the best for our health system. That is not the type of system we want. And we have to ask the same type of question. I'll come back to that for the educational system. Do we have the right principles for our educational system, or do we need changes here as well? So you can go through that. Obviously, the economic system needs changes. Circular economy is a buzzword that everybody uses, but hardly anybody has thought about what it really means, because it is a profound change in the way we handle things. The financial system, very often forgotten, but a financial system, just like an economic system, that needs growth in order to be stable is not something that is sustainable. So the financial system also needs basic reforms. And of course, this will not be possible without changing democratic ways, without reviving democracy to an extent that it has lost or never had at the moment. All of these changes basically are in line with the Sustainable Development Goals that were accepted by the United Nations unanimously, and that essentially have two agendas. human security agenda and planetary boundary agenda. And the issue is that we have to connect these two and solve them synergistically and not have a competition between them, and also not try to do them consecutively. Because we've done that for many years now. And if you look at this graph with the Human Development Index on the horizontal and the ecological footprint on the vertical, so good life for all is the horizontal, and within the planetary boundaries is the vertical line. And everything that is below the horizontal line in the green part, that is ecologically sound. And everything that's to the right of the vertical line in the blue part, that is, from a point of view of societies, overall sort of okay. I know in details there's many problems, but the Human Development Index above 0.8 is considered acceptable. And every dot here is a country. And what we've been doing in the past 30 or more years is trying to help the nations that are not within the blue area to move into the blue area. And in doing so, that was mainly the developing countries, help them to move to where the industrial nations already are. And in doing so, they have always started to exceed the ecological footprint that is available. So we have not shown that if we have sort of advanced the Human Development Index, we can afterwards consider the environment and reduce our footprint. We haven't shown it, and you just need to look at Austria, how difficult it is to let go of some things which we consider indispensable. So we have two different tasks. We have to reduce our ecological footprint, and the developing nations have to find ways of achieving higher values for the Human Development Index without exceeding the ecological footprint of 2 hectares, 2 global hectares. So it is not the same agenda. The industrialized world and the developing world does not have the same agenda. They have the same goal, hopefully, but they don't have the same agenda. And you can also look at that from the point of view of the donut economy. I don't know whether you are familiar with that. It's a concept that was developed by Kate Raworth, 2014. And essentially, the outer boundary of that green donut is the planetary boundaries, is sort of how much can we encroach on the planetary systems, how much can we interfere with the planetary systems. And the inner boundary is sort of societal thresholds, like food, water, but also participation. You could say human rights. What is necessary to live a dignified life in the sense of fulfilling human rights. And what is left in between is sort of the area where economy can happen, can develop. At the moment, we are seeing that economy, it's not scientifically not sound, but just from a point of view of picture, an economy that needs to grow obviously has to encroach either on the planetary boundaries or reduce the societal thresholds. So what we really need is to stay within both, in both cases. And if we look at that calculated for different countries of the world, you can see on the horizontal the biophysical boundaries that are transgressed, the number of boundaries that are transgressed. And the countries on the right-hand side where many boundaries are transgressed, that's the industrialized nations. And on the vertical, the thresholds in social thresholds that are not achieved. And you can see, that are achieved. Industrial nations are rather high on that scale, whereas developing nations are rather low. What we really would like is countries all in the left-hand top corner, and no one is there. And again, we see the same thing. There's different challenges for the different parts of the world. Now, coming to our part of the world, what can the components of transformation be? Well, we need to rethink our values. Which ones can we still afford? And obviously, an economic system that needs to grow in order to be stable is not sustainable. Many other aspects. I don't want to go into them in detail. But we also need longer-term thinking. Both of this, rethinking values and looking at longer-term goals, is something which was looked at what happened to civilizations that disappeared, and to civilizations that were close to disappearing but then survived. And it seems that those civilizations that were in trouble but survived, they looked at these two issues and made changes here. They started looking farther into the future, and they started to rethink their values. Doesn't mean you have to throw over all values, but you have to start reflecting which values are worth keeping and which are necessary to keep and which can we still afford. And in simple wording, what it also means is that we have to look at quality of life rather than standard of living. Standard of living is very strongly linked to material use of materials, use of energy, whereas quality of life is not linked to that, at least not above a certain threshold. So if we want to do that, rethink our values, longer-term thinking, and look at quality of life rather than standard of living, that is a cultural change. So it is not just a technological change we're looking to that will need to happen, it's a cultural change that will need to happen. So we need to adjust to a new understanding. Part of it is very old, we've just lost it. Nature is not an inexhaustible reservoir at our disposition, but a complex organism of which we are a part, and we cannot live without it. And somehow we've forgotten that. We will have to learn to only want what is available within ecological and societal limits. And that means that some things that we thought were our due just will not be attainable. We will have to learn to be satisfied with less. Sufficiency. By the way, something every single religion teaches. Sufficiency. We've also lost sight of that. That enough can really be enough. And even if it's cheaper to buy more, it's not necessary to buy more because enough is enough. So, to recapitulate, 1.5 degrees Celsius is not the ideal climate, but the climate would be stabilized, and adaptation to that climate is possible. And the transformation needed to achieve this can be what the Earth for All publication by the Club of Rome called the big leap forward. It could be the big leap forward that is needed to achieve sustainable development. If you haven't read the book Earth for All, 50 years after the limits to growth, the book considers two scenarios. One is too little, too late. That is sort of the pathway we're on now. And the other is the big leap forward with transformation and really turnarounds in 5 different areas. And what I discussed now could be exactly what we need in order to achieve the sustainable development. It means that we have to change our thinking, and I'm quoting Greta Thunberg now, as long as we focus on what is politically possible instead of what is necessary, there's no hope. So what we really need to focus on is what is necessary. If it is necessary to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030, let's think about how to do it. And this is a different type of thinking than thinking of what could I do next, what would be easy. I don't know, eating less meat or whatever. No, how can I achieve minus 50% by 2030? And if solutions are not possible to find within a system, then perhaps the system needs to be changed. We cannot change nature, but we can change all human-made systems. And I'd like to at this point out that climate change is something that natural sciences describe, but climate crisis is a societal problem. And there is this belief that the climate issue is an environmental issue. No, it's not. It's a societal issue. And we have to understand that in order to take the actions that are needed. So this graph looks very complicated, and I don't want to go into details of it, but what it shows you is that starting with changes in the physical world, like temperature rise, like sea level rise, they have consequences in society, in the economic world. So with temperature rise, with more extreme weather events, with sea level rise, disparities in economics, in economic strength, the differences in wealth of nations increased, and also in wealth of people. We know by research that it's always the poorer nations, the poorer people that are more hard hit by the same extreme events. And we also know that extreme events, due to the geography, hit some of the poorest countries most frequently and most heavily. So these changes in the natural system have consequences for the societal system. They cause migration, they cause conflicts, and therefore also increased mortality, political instability, and unstable countries, unstable governments are less able to supply their citizens with their basic needs. So this again increases instability. So there's all sorts of feedback mechanisms in this that enlarge the original problem. So where are we headed? And now you can see I'm moving towards the pessimistic scenario. If we look at this graph, it dates back to 2017, but it hasn't changed very materially. We can see that business as usual will take us to temperature increases of 4.1 to 4.8 degrees by the end of the century. If we look at the policies that have been declared and the commitments that have been made to the Paris Agreement, we come down to something like 2.6 and 3.7 degrees. That is quite an achievement. Let's not overlook that. That is quite an achievement. The promises that have been made are an achievement, but we're still far from where we have to go. That is the 1.5 degrees at the very bottom, the green line. And if we look at the latest gap report, the gap between what should be and what is by the UNEP that is published every year, they called it this year, they called it the closing window. And yeah, you can see here the same type of graph, and you can see that the commitments made so far, and commitments are not yet actions that have really been taken. Just look at our own commitments that we've made. The gap between the commitments and where we need to go, we still miss 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions that we need to be reduced by 2030. So the gap, this is global level again, the gap is huge. And while we're discussing this, temperature keeps rising. And you can see in this graph, the last 7 years of temperature, or most of those 7 years were much higher than you would expect from the linear temperature increase that started in the 1970s around. And we don't fully understand why that is so. We understand the first 3 years, or we think we understand them. They are due to an El Nino event that always goes with higher temperature increases. But the last 3 years are no longer due to El Nino. Might be a consequence of some aerosol effects that we don't fully understand. It might also be a reason that some of our sinks, oceans, soils, plants, are no longer as strong as we thought they were. And this definitely will happen. Whether it's already happening now, we don't really know. It could have also just be this chaotic system with some freak values. We don't really know, but it's a bit disquieting to see that that linear curve sort of does no longer describe what is happening. And we also see the extreme events. The drought in Austria, you might remember this year, it was not only in Austria, you can see it was all over Europe, it was all over the United States. It was in East Africa where it caused famine, it was in China, so it was in very, very many places. And it's not only drought. We also had storms, heavy rain, floods, hail, you name it. And the floods in Pakistan, you might be aware, they are really a climate catastrophe, if there's no other word for it. 33 million people affected that had to leave their homes because of the floods. It is not surprising that Pakistan was the main pusher of at the last conference of the parties in Egypt, asking the industrialized nations to finally come up with funds to cover the losses that developing countries are experiencing and the damage they are experiencing. They were only successful in putting it on the agenda. They were successful in achieving that the decision was taken to create a fund, but there was no agreement on who was to fill the fund and how much was to be in the fund or who was to get money out of the fund. So they sort of decided an empty bucket, but that's as far as they got. It's not surprising that the developing world is losing patience. Now, I said that we don't understand those increases over the last years. And what we do see, and this is just empirical evidence from the past, is that science systematically underestimates change. This is a graph from sea level rise. And the IPCC that was published in 1990 had sort of this gray area. I hope you can see the gray, yeah. It has the gray area of possible, within this range, we would expect sea level rise. And you can see we were right. The IPCC was right. Sea level rise, the blue and the red line, are within that range. But they are at the very upper top of that range. And this is what happens to us all the time. Every IPCC report sort of states that the last IPCC report underestimated where we were going to. And this is problematic because the effects of temperature rise are not linear. The impacts are not linear. If you look at this left part of the diagram, it is sort of climate sensitivity. What is the likeliest increase in temperature? That would, in this case, be somewhere around 2.5 degrees Celsius in this graph. And what science looks at is the dark blue area. So we look at plus minus 1 sigma about. But the fat end is not very often considered. And if we look at the impact, then the impact of the most likely sensitivity, it is very small compared to the impact of the fat end of that curve. And if you multiply that, you get the risk. And obviously, we're not looking at the greatest risks. We're looking at more likely risks, but not at the greatest risks. Now, you don't always have to look at the greatest risks. You don't always have to imagine the worst possible. But it does make sense to have a look at it before you take your decisions, especially since we don't really know what the future will be like. There are many possible futures, and we can only partly influence them. There is the likely future. That is sort of what was dark blue beforehand. That is, business as usual. Then there's a desirable future, which is obviously different. I'll call 1.5 degrees desirable, even though I showed you that maybe it's not so desirable, but it's definitely preferable to anything else that is within the realm of our view. But of course, there's also a range of futures that is plausible, and there's a range of futures that is possible, from a scientific point of view, possible, not very likely, hopefully, but possible. And I want to look at one of those futures that is possible, and that is my pessimistic scenario. And I just quote the Pope here in his Laudato Si. He says, the alliance between the economy and technology ends up sidelining anything unrelated to its immediate interests. If that is true, and if it continues to be true, then the pessimistic scenario is well worth looking at. We have in the climate system something called tipping points. Points beyond which there is sort of no return to the original state. And the crossing of these tipping points becomes more likely if we're involved in some sort of feedback processes, positive feedback processes. Now, positive doesn't mean that it's we want it. It just means that whatever you start in one direction, it continues in the same direction. Ice albedo feedback is one of the best known of these feedbacks. As the climate warms, ice melts. The surface that comes that is set free is darker. Therefore, more solar energy is absorbed. Therefore, it becomes warmer. More ice melts. The surface becomes even darker, even warmer. More ice melts, and so on. So that keeps going once you've set it off. And you can see once you've set it off, you don't need to add more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It just continues on its own. And the same is true for the water vapor feedback. Water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. So as we warm the ocean, more water vapor evaporates, and so on. There's a whole lot of such tipping points that we know of. And you can see here by the different shapes and colors at what temperature increase we expect these self-enhancing processes to exceed tipping points where we can no longer stop them. And you can see some of them, especially in the northern part of our globe and also in the Antarctic, can also happen before we reach 2 degrees Celsius. So there's a danger here. Let's look at what that means. If we look at the past 600,000 years and look at the temperature in this period, we can see that there's 2 states of climate, warm periods and ice ages. And the climate switched between those 2 about every 100,000 years. We understand why that is so. That has astronomical reasons. And if we draw this in a somewhat different manner, it looks something like this. We have these 2 sort of semi-stable situations of climate, ice ages and warmer periods. And the switch between the 2 has to do with the trajectory of the Earth around the sun and has to do with the tilting of the Earth's axis. And we know that these triggered the change from one situation into the other situation and back again. What we are now doing is we're triggering a move of Earth climate towards the warmer end. Now, that is not something unheard of. It has been much, much warmer on this Earth, but not with 8 billion people. So we're moving towards that end. And we can look at the past history of climate and look what happens. Is there another sort of semi-stable situation? And we can't really make one out. Now, that might be because we don't have enough details, might be many other reasons, but we can't make one out. So what the fear is that we move in a situation where the climate becomes hotter and hotter and hotter, and we call that hothouse Earth. And no stabilizing factor that sort of stops this development until temperatures which are way beyond what is conductive to human civilization. Maybe not to human life. There might be individuals and maybe some small groups of our species that can survive in certain limited areas, but on the whole, it would be the end of civilization, our civilization as we know it. Now, there's 2 big questions even within this sketch. The one is this true? Is there no other stabilizing factor that sort of can save us? And the other is, how far are we on that way? Have we already crossed the summit, or are we still on the upward path? And if we stop in time, we can still stabilize climate? We don't know. However, it seems that that the decision we have to take now is whether we want to stabilize climate or accept the risk of continuous warming, hothouse Earth. 1.5 degrees, which is what science at the moment believes is sort of the threshold beyond which we shouldn't go, that is less than it was at the time of Paris. At the time of the Paris Agreement, science still thought that 2 degrees would do the trick. 2 degrees would make sure that we can still stabilize. Meanwhile, we have seen that a lot of changes occur at lower temperatures than we expected. So what climate science now says, let's not exceed 1.5 degrees if we want to stabilize. And 1.5 degrees will be exceeded in the early 1930s. There's a lot in the pipeline, so we cannot really move this date significantly, but we can make sure that we don't exceed it significantly. And that means that we need to take measures that take effect in this decade. Measures that take effect in this decade. So we're not looking for new technologies or completely different systems of government. We have to make do with what we have now in order to solve those problems. Now, once again, it's a pessimistic scenario, but this is the dimension that makes the climate issue something special. It's not one of the many issues on the agenda. It's an issue of extreme urgency. Now, we're not sure that this pessimistic scenario is real, but as the authors of one of the important studies on this point said, it's too risky to bet against. So let's not try out. We can't go back if we try it out. Biodiversity might be of similar urgency, but it's less well understood. I'll skip these. There's loops now, societal loops now happening due to a lot of unsolved problems that lead to more chaos, because chaos causes short-term, a prioritization of short-term issues, and that reduces our ability to take sound solutions for problems. And that is also a self-enhancing loop. At the same time, there's also a political loop going on because people tend to sacrifice freedom for the sake of safety, security. And that means we're also moving in a political direction which goes away from democracies. And one way, or there's different ways to cut across these loops, and there's different entry points to cut across these loops. One is to point out long-term effects that need to be taken into account. Another is to encourage and call for diversity, because only by looking at the diversity will we find good solutions, also in science. And finally, we need to supply scientific evidence and call for its consideration in political process. And that is why it is so important to build up trust in science. And building up trust in science is necessary. I think we have lost a lot of trust over the last few years, and we need to build up that trust in order to be able to influence the course of political decisions. And that trust in science can only be achieved if we open up again, if we do not continue on this only admitting certain hypotheses. In science, all hypotheses must be permitted and tested. When it's proven that they cannot hold, that they are in contradiction to evidence, that's fine, you can discard them, but not before that. You cannot follow hypotheses merely because they are politically wanted. So science is the place where all hypotheses must be tested. Natural sciences has an advantage there because we can always test against reality, but we must make sure that we have the appropriate data to do that, or try to find those data. We must retain those hypotheses with the most explanatory power and the least contradictions, and only retain them for the time being until we have better solutions, and any hypothesis that is retained is subject to falsification. I'm not telling you new things. That's what science is about. Arguments must be transparent and traceable, and uncertainty is an integral part of science. Now, climate science has learned the hard way that we need to also discuss this uncertainty. And what the climate science community has come up with in the IPCC reports is this matrix, which has on the one hand the evidence, how much do we have, how reliable is it, how consistent is it, that's the one axis. And the other axis is the agreement of the hypothesis, not how many scientists think one thing and how many think another thing, but how far are these hypotheses, how far do they differ? If there's very little discrepancy between the hypotheses, and if we have good evidence, good data, then that's the right-hand top corner, then we have high agreement and robust evidence, and that is something we can tell politicians, this is robust data, this is robust evidence, you can build on that. It's still science, still can be wrong. Nevertheless, that is something that we can really suggest to build on. On the other hand, if there's low agreement and limited evidence, we shouldn't build on it. Doesn't mean we don't communicate it, but we must communicate it with the information that this is not robust science. It is not what most scientists believe. All new ideas start with individuals or small groups of scientists. So it is not a majority rule type of thing. The divergence of the hypothesis must be encouraged in order to really have the scientific discussion that we need. And science is not about people, it is about hypothesis and evidence. So it doesn't matter whether the person propagating a hypothesis is a Nobel Prize winner or somebody who comes from the outside. You might be more inclined to believe the one than the other, but you must test the hypothesis in the same rigorous manner. Discussions must be open and transparent, and modesty in all statements is in order. Science also has responsibility towards society. If we have found out that we are on the brink of a catastrophe, changes which really endanger our civilization, then we have to interact with society. We cannot just say, I published it in a peer-reviewed journal and go and read it there if you would like to know something. So results must be made available to society. We must also anticipate upcoming scientific questions. And conduct the research all the way to the point where it is useful for society. So there's changes that we need to make. We must also prevent abuse of science, and I don't have time to go into that, but there are some very nice examples of that. And in the case of climate change, and also biodiversity loss, essentially in sustainability, science has not been very successful in making the severity and the urgency of the problems understood. And so we need to reflect upon our role as scientists. You might be aware that some scientists called for a strike of climate scientists. Climate scientists should no longer publish until politicians start acting, because there's no use in new knowledge if it's not acted upon anyway. Now, that was not followed, and it's not being followed. I think that's okay. Nevertheless, also the International Scientific Council issued a report called Unleashing Science, delivering missions for sustainability. And it says quite clearly, business as usual approaches to science and science funding are no longer appropriate to this massively complex and urgent challenge we're facing. And it is calling on the scientific community, on universities, on the science as a whole, to think different, find different solutions than business as usual. This calls for courage and it calls for commitment. And they list a whole lot of issues where we need to change. Now, if you read those, you can think, well, we were doing all of that. If we've already done all of that, we still haven't been successful. So we must do something different. And I think that is the big challenge. I cannot tell you what we need to do different. I can give you some ideas. We have a project running amongst 17, I think now it's 19 universities in Austria. It's called UNINETS, and it's essentially about bringing SDGs to universities and then to the government from universities. But we found that if we want society to transform, we first have to transform our own house, our universities. And we issued a policy statement for the transformation of higher education institute to become pioneers of societal sustainability. And it calls for change. It calls for radical change. For instance, making the third mission of the universities the priority. There's a lot of call for change in that. And it has triggered an enormous discussion. The rectorates are not all happy with that. Some of them are enthusiastic, some of them are fighting it, but that's exactly what we need. We need to discuss this. We need to start a discussion of what does science need to do in order to, I'll call it that, save our civilization. And even the UNICO issued a manifesto for sustainability in the year 2020, where it says, in view of the global climate crisis, the threat to vital resources and imminent disruptive disintegration of economic systems based on fossil fuels, the universities see themselves as thought leaders, making a significant contribution to sustainable development through their extensive science experience. Due to the high urgency, efforts must be intensified at all levels to achieve this. So let's take this big leap forward. I think we're called on to take that leap. It's this generation of university teachers, of university students, that is called on to make that leap. And I hope I can have contributed to encourage you to really take that leap. Thank you for your attention.